All right, let's jump into it. So welcome everyone to today's webinar, Getting Payroll Implementation Right. My name is Mark Oliver Fiedler. I'm founder and CEO of Payzaar. I'm very excited about today's session. I'm joined by Rob Falkner. He's a head of payroll at Mercury Engineering. And I'm also joined by Jen Keane, who is product manager here at Payzaar. As you can tell from the title, in today's session, we're going to be talking a lot about a very important topic, and that's how to implement a global payroll solution. If you've been following our webinars, you've heard us talk a lot about why to implement a global payroll solution in the first place. What are some of the different models, how you can roll out a global payroll solution, how to build a business case, which is obviously very important before you can launch a global payroll project, and topics like that. But ultimately, the rubber really hits the road, as they say, once you start rolling out your global payroll solution. And that's not an easy undertaking. That's typically a major transformation project. And so there's lots of learnings and lots of pitfalls along the way. And some of those we want to highlight to you today. So that's why we're joined by Rob. Rob has a ton of experience. He'll introduce himself in a moment, but he's worked in the payroll industry for many years, has seen many payroll implementations in different types of organizations. So we'll get his perspective and experience. And the way we've structured the session today kind of have two parts to it. In the first part, Rob and myself, we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned, some of the challenges to be aware of, and how to tackle them, make sure you have a successful payroll implementation. And then in the second part, I'm going to pass it over to Jen to talk a bit about how you can use technology and tools in order to facilitate your payroll implementation. And she'll give you a little glance behind the scenes of how we manage that kind of implementation project with our platform at Payzaar. Okay. So before we jump in, just a couple housekeeping items for everyone here on the call. The session is being recorded, and we will make the recording available usually a few days after today's webinar. Secondly, if you do have questions, please use the QA button at the bottom of your screen. You can type questions in there, and then someone from our team will pick up those questions. Either we'll try to answer those questions throughout the session as we go along, but we also keep a bit of time at the end to answer any questions that we collect throughout the conversation today. Yeah. So with that, let's jump right into it. So, Rob, if you're ready to get going here, maybe just to get us started, if you want to introduce yourself and just let people know a little bit about your background,
sure.
That would be fantastic.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm Rob Falkner. I'm currently the group head of payroll at Mercury Engineering. I've been in payroll now for 16 years. Which I almost couldn't believe myself when I saw that this morning. I couldn't believe it's been 16 years. 14 of those have been spent working on global payrolls, and 8 of those years have been spent on kind of the management side of things. And look, throughout those 16 years, I've kind of seen it all. I've been on all sides of the fence. I've worked on the provider side. Whilst the majority has been on the customer side, I have worked on the provider side. I've worked for private companies, public companies, banking, startups, umbrella companies. So you kind of name it, I've kind of been there and seen it. And then on the management side, kind of my last 3 roles really have been, part of the role has kind of been to assess, do the business have the right payroll strategy? Do we like where we are at the moment? And obviously that's kind of, you're only really brought in because there's probably doubts around that, and kind of but what else do you do? This is where we are now. But do we like what we're doing? Have we outgrown it? I mean, that's kind of another common one, is as companies grow, you might be implementing something for 100 people that works great, but then when you get to 2,000 in 20 locations, it might not work anymore. So that's kind of been the focus on my management side of things over the last kind of 2 or 3 roles, and that has involved some pretty big transformation projects along the way.
Fantastic. So yeah, as you said, you've seen a lot. You've seen it.
Yeah.
I dare say you've seen it all. Talking about implementation, then more specifically, Rob, what are some of the biggest challenges that you have encountered when we talk about a payroll implementation project?
I think the first one I'd say is timing. I mean, typically when you do a project like this, when you move providers or you're with one provider and you go to another one, it's very rare. I mean, I've never seen it myself where you do it piece by piece and you kind of take half of your payrolls leave in 1 month and then the rest go another. It's normally it's either your end of your contract or you've handed in your notice to your contract, and therefore all of your payrolls need to move on date X, and you have that long to kind of get from where you are now to where you want to be and kind of make that decision. So I think timing is obviously a big one. And what you have to bear in mind there is, whilst you've got this big project going on to move providers, you have to keep everything else running in the background whilst you're taking on this project. So it's unlikely you're going to bring in a whole new team on top of your existing team to do this project. It's going to be the existing team that are doing this project. So it's kind of keeping the lights on, keep everything running with your current provider, but at the same time in the background, you're trying to seamlessly move to a new provider and kind of deal with everything that comes along with that. So I think timing is definitely a big one. And it can sometimes be daunting. It can kind of be a reason why companies may hesitate, because it is such a big uptake in often quite a short space of time. Now, 6 months to 12 months might sound like a long time, but there are a lot of moving parts, which I'm sure we'll get into. The second one I'd say, another big challenge is getting everyone on board. So if something's not working well for the payroll team, that's something that you're not happy and you want to move your payroll to a new provider, or you want to explore those options. But what you need to remember with payroll as well is that it reaches out and kind of crosses over into so many other teams. So obviously senior management need to be aware if you want to take on a big transformation project. So you kind of need to be keeping them up to date and have them on board and kind of with you. And like you mentioned earlier, kind of making a proposal to senior management, kind of what you want to do. So that, again, that's getting everyone on board. That would be senior management, HR. Obviously, you work with them on a daily basis. They want to be happy with the new solution. IT, finance, internal security, legal. So again, whilst it's your project, it reaches out to so many different parts of the business, and that's something that you can't really underestimate. You can't just kind of say, "Oh, we're unhappy, we're going to do this," and then flick the switch and then just tell all the others after and go, "This is what we're doing," because there's bound to be questions from those other teams. There's bound to be hesitation again, because it is such a large project. So again, that's another one, is kind of having everyone on board. And that's not to say people are going to actively be against you. It's more just having that open communication and making sure that everyone is on board with your timelines and on board with what you want to do. And then the last one I've got noted down here is picking the right solution for you. And I think this is obviously a very important one, a big challenge, is picking that right one. I mean, in my opinion, the payroll market, it's kind of really evolved over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, and certainly for the better. Like, there are more and more options now. No longer are we in that world where it's not just that one option where you go and pick that global vendor and that's who you work with, So, but that can also bring its own challenges, Now you've got all these options. Well, which one is the right one? That's a challenge in itself. How do we know what direction we want to go? What do we need to have in place to make sure we're getting to that decision in the correct manner? So that's a big one, is kind of doing your research and making sure that the choice you make is the right one, and that you're not kind of swapping one solution for another one, because you could easily find yourself kind of back in that same, and that's kind of, I guess, part of the risk of it all, is that you don't just want to go and make this massive change in this massive project, and then 6 months later, after you've gone live, you're kind of like, well, it feels like we're back to where we were. So that's another big challenge, is making sure that you're picking the right solution for you and making sure that you're comfortable with it, and that it's gonna fix all those things that are currently not working, that are the reason why you're looking in the first place. So they'd kind of be the big three. I mean, I could probably rattle up another 50, but I think just from a very high place, that's kind of a good top three to think about.
I'm sure we'll touch on a few more as we go through some of the other points of discussion. But yeah, by the way, on that last point of picking the model that works for you, that fits your needs, just for people out there listening, we did a session on that topic of different type of solution models out there, and how to align your specific needs and priorities, right? Because depending on what you're trying to achieve, different models will, fit your specific requirements and use case better. I think it's a very important thing to know from the very beginning what you're trying to accomplish, and walk into that with your eyes wide open, right? To know what you're signing up for and what you're getting, because certainly not all global payroll solutions are created equally. I did want to pick up on one quick point that you made, which I hear quite a bit from people that I talk with out in the market about their experience running payroll transformation projects, and that's the work happening, this kind of rollout work happening on top of the normal day-to-day activities. Any advice on how do you handle that? Are there any tricks in terms of times of the year to do it or not to do it, or how to, block people from kind of other things popping up that, create additional distraction?
I think it's all in the planning, to be honest. I think a lot, like I said, it's in the planning. It's got to be, you've got to have that steps on the way. And again, I won't kind of go into every single step along the way because we could be here a long time, but there are so many moving parts, you need to kind of have, you and your team need to kind of sit down and have these big milestones picked out, basically. So milestones would be, well, okay, so first of all, what do we want a new solution to look like? Where do we find it? Who do we need to speak to get it? When do we need to have contracts signed, or when do we need to have our vendors chosen? When do we need to have contracts signed? So kind of pick out your milestones kind of between start and finish and what they need to look like and how long you need. One thing I've learned from experience really is that you can never start too early, so you may have a contract with a provider that runs out on the 31st of December, and you've got to decide 3 or 6 months in advance whether you want to roll on that contract or take on this project. But that doesn't mean that you wait until that day that you've handed in your notice or you've told that provider that you're not going to be renewing your contract. You can start planning. You can be speaking to other providers, kind of getting demonstrations, speaking to different providers in different locations to see how they run their payroll. Any provider will speak to you at any time because obviously you're a prospective new client, and these things take time. So that's I think definitely kind of another big one is don't think that you have to wait. You can if you believe that you're going to be looking in 6 months time, start 6 months before that. Start speaking to the provider and say, look, we're not looking to go live until next year or whenever it may be. We're contracted until date X, but if we did come to you, or what can you offer for us? Do you think we'd be a good fit? And that gives you lots of time to speak to lots of different people, as well. If you leave it late, you're inevitably going to speak to less. You're going to explore less options because you're going to feel like you're in more of a rush. So I think, again, I mentioned timing in my first answer, but you can never start this too early in terms of preparation. Obviously, there's only certain things you can do at certain times. You can't do your parallels until you're way further down the line, but there are so many steps on the way to that you can definitely start planning even before you've told your current provider that you're leaving or something like that, So I think that would be a big one. And typically for me, I've kind of done 2 big transformation projects in the last few years, and we've always kind of chosen to go with January the 1st as a go live date. And that's been purely coincidental of contracts running out certain times, but you also need to kind of factor in tax year end. And obviously the UK is an exception to this, but a lot of countries have their new tax year starting on January the 1st. So we've always taken it under the proviso that we kind of go for a fresh start from a fresh tax year. Again, that's not crucial as long as you have conviction and stick to the date that you do agree. I don't think there is a right and wrong date, but and it does depend on your current contract. But that's something that I've done just because, again, I feel like it brings everything to a natural conclusion, and then you starting afresh in a fresh new year, everyone's taxable earnings and things like that. But I won't get too technical. But so yeah, it's all in the planning, it's all in the timing, and no, you can never start too early, and you can't speak to enough people. There's no harm in you speaking to you'd rather speak to 50 than 1, and then at least that way you're more confident in the decision that you're making and the provider that you're choosing.
Yeah. So picking up on some of the learnings that you've gone through as you've done, as you said, various big implementation projects over the years. If you look back, or I suppose if you were to start a new project now, right, with the experience that you've gathered over those years, what would you do differently today than maybe how you approach things in the past?
I think I kind of start earlier. Don't be afraid to make those connections. Kind of speak and what I in the first transformation project, I kind of was not starting from scratch, but I didn't utilize my existing connections. So if you have connections on LinkedIn, or you have connections from previous roles, or you know other payroll managers that may have done this, kind of speak to those people and kind of speak to people that have been through these kind of process. And even if you don't know if they've been run, just kind of ask them to look for advice, or do you know any providers in location X, or do you know any good software providers, or what model have you got? And kind of just, and again, because you can't speak to enough people about that kind of thing. You can never know too much, you know? So, and again, that doesn't mean that if it works for person A, it's going to work for you, but getting those experiences and kind of finding out what those pitfalls may be along the way, or kind of just any help you can get along the way, I think is crucial. And again, part of that starting early is doing your research, vetting your vendors, speaking to people that have used them before, or people that you know in the industry, and say, hey, look, I think this could be a good idea. I know that you might know someone that has done a similar thing. So just rely on all that information. Don't kind of put your head down and kind of run into it blind and kind of, I'll do it my way and this is how it's going to go. And I think the other one is kind of, however smooth you think this is going to go, there are going to be things that happen along the way. There are going to be delays. So again, it's all about that planning side of things. And if you have that clear project plan and you know what steps you need to take next and in what order, that's going to be hugely beneficial. And then if you get stuck in one of those phases, so I mean, again, for example, in one of our projects before, we had a bit of a delay on the internal security side, just kind of getting answers on things like, where's our data going to be, things that you might not think about straight away, but that are obviously important with payroll, kind of where's our data being stored, how's it being stored. So you might like a provider, but when it then gets to the next stage, their data security isn't there, or something's not quite feeling right with internal security. So again, always have options available to you. So I think in my last transformation project, we kind of narrowed it down to 2 providers. We spoke to as many as possible in each location, and software providers as well. And we kind of narrowed it down and said, well, look, we'd be really happy to go with option A or B in this country. We didn't kind of just pick one and put all our eggs in that basket for that one provider. It was kind of, well, we have good options. Make sure you have good options in each location, because you don't know what could come up further down the line.
That's good advice. Yeah, keep your optionality open, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay. So the other topic, I guess, when we're talking about implementation is the speed of implementation, right? Obviously, you've got resources tied up in an implementation project, as we talked about. There's cost that comes with an implementation project. It takes up management attention. If a project goes on and on, you run the risk of famous implementation fatigue setting in, and maybe things come to a halt altogether. So how do you work with your payroll team and other stakeholders, obviously, in the process as well? So anything specifically that you can do as the payroll sponsor for the project to make sure that things move along as swiftly as possible? Yeah,
so I think from a stakeholder perspective, if you're unhappy with your current provider or your current solution, you need to be vocal about that to either your own manager or your manager's manager, or make sure that information is kind of feeding up the line, because ultimately you're going to come to them at some point and say, look, we want to take this leap, we want to make this transformation project, and it's going to be a lot quicker and a lot more transparent if you go to them after pre-warning them a year earlier that you're not happy and you're having these issues and this is an ongoing thing. We might have to look elsewhere. So don't just kind of appear one day to senior management and go, hey, we need X amount of budget for an implementation that's starting next week. Can you give me the group? So kind of, again, it sounds obvious, but it's have things like budgets all pre-arranged, have things again, timelines pre-arranged, make sure you've been communicating with your other stakeholders, and then internally, again, be extremely clear. It could be some members in your team might be new to these kind of transformation projects. So again, you have to be as clear as you can in the planning stage and outline all your big milestones, all your big dates, what each person is going to be responsible for. Different members of your team will probably have different strengths in certain areas. Some might be stronger project managers, others might be kind of better on the data side of things, the Excel side of things in terms of reporting, things like that. So they're kind of things that you need to get ahead on to assure that once you do have that your notice handed in, or you do have your 6 months or your 12 months, that you've already kind of got your boxes ticked with the wider company and your own team, that look, we're all ready to go. We know exactly what we need to do. We know what the budget is. We know how much we need to spend. We know how much it's going to cost. We have our business case in and approved. And even though we can't physically move until date X, we're planning now and we're getting ready and we're on the way, you know. So, and that's another one is kind of, don't take too much on yourself as the manager. If you are a payroll manager or an international payroll manager, don't feel like you can't burden the team with more responsibility. Don't be too afraid to kind of share the work around, because there is going to be so much work involved in so many different teams. Just make sure that everyone knows what their role is within the project. And look, typically, if a person looks after a certain location, you're going to rely on that person to help you with the implementation in that country, you know. So kind of make sure you've got the people with the knowledge in the room and on the appropriate calls. Don't go and have a call about a payroll you might not be too clued up on with a new provider without having the person that actually process the payroll at the moment, for example. You know, kind of obvious things like that. But again, it's that fine line between, well, I don't want to take up too much of their time because they're running payroll whilst we're doing this project. So sit with them, manage, again, make sure it's at a time that suits everyone, but just make sure you've got the right people in the right meetings, so then you can make the best decisions going forward and make those decisions with your team, not on your own.
And is there any specific part in that end-to-end implementation rollout process that, in your experience, is the sort of most time-consuming or takes the longest? So,
I think once you've got contract, obviously the contract process can take a little while in terms of getting things signed. But again, that's kind of, again, you kind of But once you're actually in the middle of the project and you're kind of up and running, I think that transfer of data is kind of obviously a very important stage. And this is where the relationship with your current provider, I mean, you've handed in your notice, you said you're not staying with them past that certain date, they're probably not going to be too hot on you, I guess would be the polite way of putting it. They're not going to be kind of jumping through hoops for you anymore. Yeah. At the same time, you're going to be going to them looking for data or information or missing data that you're going to need for your new provider and things like that. So that can certainly end up taking time. So from a reporting point of view, you just kind of make sure that you're getting the reports every month from your current provider that you need. And if you do need to go to them, kind of really kind of be on top of that and kind of don't let emails go into nowhere, kind of keep on top and arrange calls, kind of chase them up, because let's be honest, they're not gonna be bending over backwards to help you move from them, you know, so you're gonna have to go and do that yourself. So yeah, be hands-on on that front. Don't kind of wait for it to come to you. It can be a big one, because that's where you can get stuck, you know, and we've had that. And you might have different locations that have 500 employees and another one has 20, but the one with 20 could end up holding you up because you're not getting sent the information that you need and things like that. So again, yeah, have those things in mind and kind of don't feel like you can just park one while you focus on the other. You need to deal with all these moving parts at once. So you need different members of your team on those locations at one time to make sure that you are going to meet those deadlines.
Yeah. No, I think that it's a challenging balance or fine line to walk, right? In terms
and I mean, and once you're in this, you know, it's one of those. A transformation project like this is what, once you've committed to it, that is it. You know, there's no turning back at that stage. So you can't then, once you've made your decision, you can't kind of be hesitating or, right, well, this isn't going well. There is no turning back now. You know, you're in this. This is happening on this day. So you have to do everything you can to make sure that everything runs on time. Yeah.
So one of the other questions I wanted to ask you, Rob, is you kind of touched earlier on, different vendor models that are out there, have proliferated over the last few years. Different choices for different kind of global payroll solutions and needs. So if you think about the different vendor models, how does that impact, from your experience, how does that impact the implementation? Can you talk a bit about that? I mean, does the choice of vendor change how the implementation process needs to be managed and how you would approach things?
Yeah, I mean, definitely for me, I'd say it's one of the most important things, right? It should be, I think I touched on it earlier, like it's very much should be top of the list, that you're picking the right vendors, you're picking the right providers, and that goes for strategy as well, you know. So do we go to, we're currently with a big global provider where all of our payrolls are with them, but we're not happy, it's not working. Well, therefore, it's probably not the best idea to just go and pick another global provider and kind of go with them. And if you do, you could find yourself back in square one. So it's definitely a huge decision. And I think at the start of any transformation project, you need to map out kind of where you are now and where do you want to get to. And that should drive the decisions you make when it comes to choosing the software provider and your payroll providers. So what are your big wants? So, I mean, from a personal experience, the issues that we've had with a provider that we'd be unhappy with would typically be customer service, lack of control over tech and reporting. And so that would be kind of things that are currently, or slow response times, no dedicated account manager. So that's what you're currently receiving. But where do you want to get to? What do you want? Well, hold on, we want a dedicated account manager that speaks English for each location. So that's a big one. We want control over tech and reporting. So we want to be able to run our own reports, download our own reports in the way that we want. So therefore, maybe we shouldn't be looking at that global model because we know from experience that we don't have any control over that. We just receive those files and then we have to kind of manually fight with them to get them into the way we want them. So could we go and find a local provider in country and then have that built into an overriding piece of software that then allows us to have that control over tech and reporting? And then also you get all the other bits that you want, like the English speaking and things like that. So it's a huge decision. I think it's probably one of the, it would be crazy to kind of go through this huge project only to pick something that could ultimately put you back in that same position that you're already in, just with a different name on the label. Do you know? So I mean, these kinds of projects, they're too big and they're too stressful to be doing them every 12, 24, 36 months. You know, you kind of, these aren't things that you want to be doing every year or every 2 years. You have to get it right, and you have to pick the one that suits you and the wider business as well. Like, does it fit where the business is going in general in terms of a growth and technology phase? So yeah, for me, I think it's number one in terms of getting it right, because ultimately everyone gets paid on time, right? That's kind of goal number one, is everyone gets paid on time. And then the job for the payroll team is, well, how do you get to that stage? How easy are we getting there? Because I'm sure with your current provider, everyone's still getting paid on time, but it's that bit where, how are we getting to that point where we're getting them paid on time? It's extremely stressful, again, customer service, things like that. So if you then go and pick another solution that is going to put you back in that, it's just a waste of time for everyone. So yeah, I'd say it's kind of the priority of any transformation project is make sure you're moving to the right model that suits you.
In your experience, does that happen? Does that happen a lot, that people, kind of go into an implementation and they basically go from, vendor A to vendor B, and it ends up being sort of more or less the same.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. I think it's a common pitfall. I mean, I think the two common ones you find are companies don't move at all. They just kind of stay. They kind of stay unhappy and continue and try, because they're worried that they're going to go and do that again. You know, they haven't done the research, or they don't know that there's other things out there, other solutions out there that can tick all their boxes. So they're too apprehensive and they don't want to go and make that mistake.
Right.
And then the other
mistake. What's so painful to get into that model?
Yeah. It's once you rip the plaster off, that's it. It's kind of, you've started. So I think the other side of that is that a lot of companies do then make that decision. We are going to jump, and they speak to different providers, and they maybe get sold something that it might be another global provider, but they're getting really good answers at sales stage, or they're being sold something that sounds way better than what they've already got, or it sounds different. But then when you really kind of get into the heart of things and you've already signed the contract, you're kind of saying, well, hold on a minute, this looks very similar to what we're just leaving. So I think there are two kind of big pitfalls. Is that sales stage can get a bit, you end up believing in that sales stage when the reality is they are just another global provider. Or again, I don't want to be harsh on global providers or one fits all, but they're just not they're ticking the boxes at sales stage, but then the reality is that you're not really choosing anything different.
So any tips for people out there? How do you cut through that sort of fogginess of, hey, is this actually different, or is this more of the same that we've already been dealing with so far? Because as you say, you know, in the sales process, everything sounds good.
Yeah.
Right. Are there any specific things that you would kind of probe in and to kind of?
Yeah, I think certainly from a tech point of view, you know, it's kind of, it's very obvious if you're going from the same solution to the other in terms of these companies saying, yeah, look, we do it all for you. We do X, Y, Z. We'll provide you all the providers. This is what you, and that's, for me, that would be a red flag. Well, hold on, that's what we already have.
Mm-hmm.
And you're just saying you have a shinier version of that, you know, as where when you go and speak to purely a software provider, they might say, well, look, we're not going to run your payroll for you. We're not going to, you know, but we are going to do X, Y, and Z. We are going to provide this software that sits at the top, which then allows you to kind of go and have that freedom to choose those local providers and get that local knowledge and kind of, and deep down. And again, at sales stage, I think, make sure that that knowledge is on those calls that you're having. It's not just a sales guy that doesn't have the local knowledge. Make sure that the people you're speaking to are experts in that field, and that there is someone from that location on the call that can actually answer your direct questions about your specific needs and company, rather than just kind of saying, oh yeah, we have, you know, kind of all the typical salesy stuff, but then actually dive in and say, well, what do you have for registering employees onto this, you know, or labor, things like that. So yeah, that would be my advice, is kind of keep out for those red flags and kind of don't be fooled. Just don't kind of believe everything you hear, and kind of make sure the proof is in the pudding, so to speak, and make sure that you're getting the most out of it. I mean, I certainly won't recommend that you go from one global provider to another if you don't like that current solution. You know, why not try something different? And like I said earlier, kind of payrolls evolved from that regard. I believe there was a time where that it felt like that's all that was out there, as we're now that there's kind of a lot more out there, and that there's a lot more availability. So again, explore every avenue you can, speak to people that you know in the industry, and just get that advice and take it on board, and speak to as many people as you can. Yeah,
it certainly has evolved a lot, and you know, I suppose we've been trying to push that and been part of it for sure over the last few years. But talking about that, you know, the difference in different vendor models and relating that to the implementation process itself, I suppose, you know, what I'm observing is there's specific to an implementation different approaches as well, right? You have some providers that are very hands-on. It's kind of a fully managed implementation. You have an army of, you know, consultants that come on site and you know, kind of take apart your current payroll environment and implement a new one. And then there's other solutions, other vendor models where it's more, I suppose I would say client-led. You know, the solution empowers the client to be more enabled, more, you know, run the project themselves and manage the implementation themselves, and be given the tools to, you know, implement the technology that comes with the solution as well. And I'm curious about your experience, your views on these different models, both doing the implementation, and then I guess it also extends further into the run and maintain, right? Because payroll is never constant. There's always changes that need to be applied. So I guess people need to think ahead beyond the initial implementation. What happens after, you know, the go live date X?
And I think it's a fine line. I think it's a fine line between what you'd class as creating work for your own team, but then also giving your team the control that they need to do things efficiently. I think that's kind of the balance that you need to find, right? So because what you don't want is, when you go to a vendor or a provider or something, you want things to be automated, you want things to be at your fingertips, but at the same time, you don't want to be creating work for your own team on top of the day-to-day. So you need to make sure that those wins are kind of saving you time, rather than, you know, it sounds like you're doing the work, but what you're actually doing is you're saving time. I mean, if I use an example, a most recent example for ourselves is, now this wasn't a transformation as such, but we recently implemented a new payslip provider for our weekly payroll that has over 1,000 employees on it. And with our previous provider, one of the issues was that whenever someone wanted to reset a password, we couldn't do that for them. We had to reach out to our contact at that payslip provider and say, can you reset this password for person X? That person could then be out of the office, they could not reply for the day, and the person, your customer, your employee, sat there waiting for their new password. So And then we've moved recently to a new provider where it sounds like we're doing all the work in terms of we now have that control. We can actually just go into the system, find that person's email, click a button, reset password, and it's done within 5 seconds. And then you're back to the employee saying, check your emails, your new password is there. So that's kind of, now that's the sort of things where you want to be gaining. You know, it's not that the provider are giving you all the work and it's so labor intensive. It's actually saving you time because you're just clicking a button. You're not sending an email to someone else and waiting for them, you know, so it's giving you that control.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to payroll, you need that control over things like I just said there with your pay slips, with your reporting, your GL files. Like, you don't just want to be at the peril of your provider and having them send it on to you. You want to actually have the control of saying, hey, we want our GL file to look like this, and we want it to look like this from day one. We don't want to receive it and then have to start manually manipulating it and things like that. So that's where you need to really focus on those wins in terms of taking control of your own payroll. Because again, that's the big selling point of global providers, right? Is that we do it all for you. But the reality of that is not actually, it's very rare that you'll get 12 GL files a month that are perfect and ready to go. And then you have to manually manipulate them and you spend time. I mean, I've had payrolls before where you'd spend a whole day trying to get GL files correct, just as an example. Yeah. So yeah, I think and again, with the new technology and the evolution of kind of payroll software at the minute, you have to take advantage of these things because you are going to be saving your team time. You are possibly saving them up to a day's work per month, and you're giving them the control. And then you're also on the other end of that, the GL team are happier because they're getting their GL files correctly and on time. Your employees are happier because they can reset their password in 10 minutes rather than 2 days. And yeah, I just think, again, these things are now available to, so you know, you have to take advantage of those things if you want to, and then your team can be focusing on the really important stuff rather than getting stuck in things like that. So that would be my take on the technology side of things. Is certainly I'm a big champion of kind of take advantage, take control, because it is ultimately going to save you time. It's not actually creating work, it's reducing work involved.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I as you're saying that, it kind of reminds me of, our own sort of personal experiences. If I think about, back in the days, you would have to, go when you were traveling, go to the airline, wait in line for your, check-in and get your boarding pass printed. These days, you do the work, of course, right? You check yourself in, which used to be the agent at the gate would, do that work for you and type in your name. Now you do it, and it takes a bit of time, but it saves you a ton of time waiting in line, right? So I think it's a equivalent in payroll that we are, customers do more on their own, but with the right tools, it saves you a ton of time. Right? And
look, with payroll, I think just kind of the last thing on that is, I mean, the minimum expectation from payroll, from your employees is kind of 100% success. I think I've said that before, but that is the reality of it, is that, and it's all, and that's what you have to provide to your employees, and you'll do that. And again, I said it earlier, it's how you get to that point. It's how you do it. It's how you look after the things on the back end. It's how you deal with other stakeholders. It's how, and again, technology is a big one when it comes to that, in terms of reducing manual work, basically, or relying on third parties to do that work for you when you could easily take control yourself.
Great stuff. Rob, thank you so much. Lots of really good advice and great insights and experiences that you shared here with us. At this point, I would like to switch gears a little bit and get Jen in on our discussion here. So Jen is going to give us a little bit of a glimpse, a view of how you can manage your implementation and what kind of self-service capabilities are available in modern solutions. And so Jen, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Hey everyone, so I'm going to share just 1 or 2 slides and then a brief demo of some, I suppose, real life examples of the things that I'm going to chat briefly about. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So if you've been on a webinar with me before, you've probably heard me talking about platform as a service, or PaaS. And if you watched, recently I did a webinar with Alan. If you watch that, you'll know that I'm a big advocate for platform as a service. And one of the reasons that I am is because I think it puts the power in your hands to really guide that implementation, to take control of that implementation and to make your solution work for you, which I think is really important when you're engaging in that kind of transformation process, the ability to get a solution that's going to work for you. As Rob was saying, there's no point in replacing something that you don't like with something that is almost the same as what you don't like. So why do I like platform as a service? Well, it facilitates a lot of things, implementation at your pace. So obviously we've mentioned the difficulty of when can you do an implementation project, the fact that you have to run payroll at the same time as that implementation project is ongoing, and that you're probably going to be resourcing that from the same pool of people. So when it comes to driving an implementation, being able to do it at a pace that makes sense for your business is really important. And when you're using a solution that's delivered through platform as a service, that is usually going to mean that you can adopt parts of the platform as it makes sense for you. So you don't necessarily have to immediately say, okay, it's all or nothing on this day. Now, I know Rob did make the point that obviously in terms of processing the payrolls, you're not going to switch one country and leave another country on a different system. But in terms of some of the modules that might be offered, you might gradually transition and be able to show the value in parts. And I'm going to demonstrate that a little bit later as well. Obviously then with platform as a service, you get the benefits of operating in a cloud environment. Cloud transition is a significant thing for a lot of companies. There's a lot of people are transitioning from on-premise solutions to cloud solutions. And the reasons are obvious. They're scalable, flexible solutions, and they give you greater control about a lot of things, about how you're using the system, about what you're doing with it. Additionally, there's usually greatly reduced on-premise maintenance because a lot of that maintenance burden is going to fall to the team who's managing the cloud environment, which is going to be your provider. Lastly, and speaking specifically about Payzaar as opposed to general platform as a service, no need to rip and replace. We talked about global payroll solutions and how if you're moving from one to the other, you're probably going to be tied to certain vendors in certain locations. But with Payzaar, it works alongside your existing solutions, alongside your existing vendors. So you're not necessarily going to be tied to specific vendors in those locations. And when you're considering a large payroll transformation project, if you have vendors that you already like in certain locations, the ability to perhaps maintain that relationship with them is, in my opinion, a really big bonus to having a simpler setup and a quicker setup. So control at your fingertips. What do I mean by this? Generally speaking, platform as a service often kind of operates in a more self-enablement, client-led environment. There is obviously a setup. For example, with Payzaar, there's a setup, getting yourself set up in the system, getting those links to the vendors. But once the setup is done, you're very much in control. And what that also means is when your process changes, and as Mark mentioned, payroll is never static, you can update the system instantly to adapt. There aren't any breaks in the process and nothing slows down. So look, slides are all well and good. But what I want to do is jump into our platform briefly and talk you through some examples of what I actually mean by all of this and what it might look like in real life, because as Rob mentioned earlier, lots of people say lots of things without necessarily showing what they mean. So the first thing I want to show is a sample customer dashboard here in report only mode. What do we mean by report only mode? Well, if you've been on some of our webinars before, you're probably more familiar with a homepage that looks like this, with our neat little workflow bubbles and all of the payroll tasks to be done. But it is possible to use Payzaar in just report only mode. So to just use the reporting and the data analyzer, data maintenance functionality associated with Payzaar. I think this is a really good example of that kind of idea of a phased approach or a phased adoption. And it's a pretty great way to integrate a new system piece by piece. This modular approach, as I mentioned, just leads back to what Rob and Mark both talked about, how that rollout is happening while payroll is still ongoing. And if you were trying to get senior management, et cetera, on board with your transition, then doing something like adopting reporting while you're still figuring out some of the vendors and things like that is a really great way to show value and get the value out of reporting. Show the value of the system even before you're ready to roll out the payroll process integration. A lot of the time, these transitions are going to be about that time to value. You don't want to be months and months into trying to integrate a new system with nothing to show for it. So the ability to have this modular approach and immediately show reporting, even if you're not quite ready to go with payroll, I think is pretty cool. I do want to jump into our more often seen homepage, which is these little bubbles here, and talk about some of these self-service led tasks that we've been talking about. So obviously, as with all solutions, there's some setup required, although I do like to think that our setup is pretty straightforward. And Rob touched on the importance of kind of speed earlier. The longer it takes to implement a solution, the higher the cost, etc. So I wanted to show you how a self-service approach can help by considering some of our pay groups here. So I set up a couple of pay groups for a couple of different countries. And imagine you've been through the process, you've got everything set up, everything is working, and then there's an acquisition. And suddenly, on potentially a very short timeline, you need to have payroll up and running in a new country. In some more typical or traditional models, that would be a lot of back and forth communication with your provider. That would potentially be that circumstance, like Rob mentioned, with passwords, where you're emailing back and forth, you're waiting for someone to come online, etc. So I want to just jump in here to our Portugal pay group. And if you note, we have a duplicate button up here. So when you click that, you can choose what you want to duplicate that's going to make sense for your setup. For example, it's new, so you're probably not going to duplicate the calendar, but the workflow setup, you're probably going to want to report it on the same dates. The reporting setup, you don't have to do that mapping again. And we're going to set that up there and save. And with a few clicks, we are most of the way into having a new pay group set up for a new country. We'll need to just make sure that we're coordinated, make sure that we've got our right partner set here. We can, of course, review our workflow setup and change the dates if they're not appropriate. But with just a few clicks, we have a great head start of getting our new country, Spain, set up and running. And that's really what I mean when I talk about self-service really facilitating people being able to change their process and make the process work for them. We haven't had to get on the phone with somebody. We haven't had to send a lot of emails to a provider. We're just able to set up the new pay group ourselves and get it configured and working and get most of the way there without any changes. So I want to briefly log in from the other side of the equation here as a partner and look to my Ireland pay group here that's at a payroll approval stage. I want to use this to just demonstrate to you how having the self-service approach can help you to manage changes in your payroll. So as we know, the dreaded COVID brought a lot of in-flight changes to payroll teams. There were a lot of different government supports that were coming in, new, constantly changing payments. It was a really challenging time for everyone. And obviously it was very difficult to manage all of those payroll changes. But again, I want to show you how a self-service approach can kind of help you roll with the punches in that respect. So previously, I have set up my reporting here, and I've mapped it with my gross to net. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and drop in a gross to net here that's going to have some additional fields, because this month we have a new thing. There's a new payment. So you can see straight away, the system has detected, oh, you've got a new field here. Do you want to go ahead and map that now? Again, we're not in a situation where we have to go back, talk to the provider, organize this mapping, make sure that that gross to net file can be processed. Just in flight, we can go ahead and map the new field. So in this case, I've added a government COVID top up here. We could go ahead and just map that. Let's call it sick pay and save that. You can see our new top up fields down here, and we can go ahead and continue processing the gross to net. So with just a few clicks, our payroll process can continue without interruption. So I think that this is the kind of thing that really shows the value essentially of a self-service approach. We haven't had a block here. We're able to go ahead, and send our payroll request without any further intervention. So as Rob mentioned earlier, I think a big part of that transformation is really getting everybody on board. And I think time to value is a really big part of that. So showing the value as soon as you possibly can to senior management, to HR, et cetera, is a really great way to get them on board. And when you have platform as a service and that self-service approach, you can be really very proactive in delivering that value in a way and at a speed that's going to work for your company. I know those are just 2 or 3 very quick examples, but what I really wanted to show is that if you're savvy about choosing your provider, you can get a provider who does deliver on that promise of a fluid process. You can get a provider that does deliver on a self-service approach that doesn't put more work onto you, but it really enables you to have the process work for you and to unblock yourself if ever you are blocked. So hopefully this has shown the value of having a platform as a service and a self-service led approach, how powerful that can be when we're thinking about what we need to do to execute quickly and effectively on a payroll transformation project. I'll pass it back to you, Mark and Rob, because I know there were already some questions popping into the Q&A during your conversation earlier.
Yeah, very good. Thanks, Jen, for that overview. That was very good, very nice to see. And I think, as you said, it speaks exactly to, you know, how can you organize your implementation to make it more, efficient, to make it more speed up the rollout, break it down into manageable chunks, right? I think you spoke to that with the example of maybe, you start with just the data aggregation, and that creates some nice quick wins within the rollout process before you get into some of the maybe more complex changes that you want to make. So at this point, this is really kind of gets us to the end of the prepared remarks. I guess at this point, we'll like to open it up to any questions that people have relative to what Jen just showed, relative to what Rob and I talked about before. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them into the Q&A chat, and we will pick them up from there and try to answer them as best as we can. Let's see, we have one coming in that's asking about, what about organizations that don't have the internal resources to handle an implementation themselves? Okay. Rob, you want to take a stab at that, or I can give it a go?
Yeah, I think the help is out there. Do you know? I mean, if we use Payzaar for an example, I know that I've used Payzaar in the past in a previous company, and one of the issues we had was, manpower, or we don't have contacts, or we need you to help us find these new providers. And what Payzaar did for us there was they put us in touch with providers that they know, providers that they've worked with in the past, just from experience, and kind of they know that work well. They don't kind of, it's not like, I'll make sure you use these. It's kind of, look, we'll send you a number of options in each location, and we'll help you have those introductory calls. We'll help you chat, and we'll help you see if that's what you want. And if that's what you want to do, we can then help you at implementation stage. So correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, here, but I mean, again, if we stick with the kind of the Payzaar example, like, you guys are on hand to help as much as possible as needed during implementation. If you feel like you haven't got the manpower.
I think one of the important things to point out is, while platform like Payzaar is designed and built to empower the customer to do a lot of the things themselves, some of the examples that Jen just showed, we do have a team. We have a implementation and a customer support team, and as much as the customer requires help and wants to have us come in and do some of the things that they potentially could do themselves, but maybe due to resource constraints are not able to do, we can do that for them on their behalf. So that's a very flexible model, right? And you can decide, depending on the location, depending on the timing, how quickly you want to get something rolled out. You might want to get a bit more support from the vendor, or if you say, no, I'm prefer to do it kind of at my pace, and I have the resource, and you can do it all yourself. So I think it just gives you that much flexibility to kind of move into the implementation with the support model that fits your specific needs.
Yeah.
So let's see, there's another question coming in here from Roberto that was asking about what does global mean when it comes to payroll now and an outlook for the future. That's an interesting question. I suppose I'll try to answer that from my perspective, and I will say that I think those of us working in the global payroll space, we use the word global a lot of times quite loosely. Typically, I think people start talking about global the moment you have, you're crossing borders and you're talking about maybe 4 or 5 different jurisdictions. Because as we know, that starts to really exponentially increase the complexities of managing your payroll environment across all these different local legislative and regulatory environments. So I think when we use the word global, it doesn't necessarily mean I have the whole globe. I have people around the world. It could be that you have a certain number of countries in one region, right? And that requires a multi-country support model that helps you to create visibility, oversight, governance around your payroll operations that are distributed across those different countries. That would be my perspective. I don't know, Rob, you've been in this space for a very long time. So
I think global for me now, or global from my perspective means, so if I use Mercury where I am at the moment, it basically means that the payroll team is completely run out of Dublin. So we kind of have that shared service center model, right? So that means that if Mercury won a contract in Australia, in London, in Japan, wherever that is found, that payroll will be processed from the team in Dublin, because that's the model that we're now running under. And I think that is what a lot of international companies are doing, because obviously it makes a lot more sense to have one centralized team than it does to have 16 locations and you've got 16 different people in those 16 locations all running the payroll themselves from that country, because then you're not going to have that centralized way of doing things. You're going to have reports looking different from each. Everyone's going to have their own way of working. So I think when I think global, I think it kind of, for me, it means that within the company that I'm in, any payroll that goes live across anywhere in the world will come through our team. And that's kind of how I would see it. But yeah, like you said, we don't have payrolls in 300 locations, but we do have some in Asia, some in Europe, some in LATAM. So yeah, that's kind of how I would view global at this stage.
I think that's a great addition to, multiple countries managed kind of from a centrally.
Yeah, correct.
I think is kind of the general understanding. I think we have time for one last question before we wrap up here. So I'm looking at the time. And the question is, doesn't a self-enablement approach create additional work for the payroll team? And I think we kind of addressed that a little bit. Rob, you were talking about that. Well, on the one hand, yes, you're running an implementation.
Yeah.
That's work on it on top of your normal, day-to-day payroll job. Mm-hmm. And when you're doing that in a self-enabled manner, it does put more things onto your desk to do. But I think you also explained the example of, if you have the right tools and you have the technology, it actually speeds things up rather than slows things down, right?
I think the term was kind of, it's a fine line, and you're right, it is that. It's kind of making sure that the things you are taking on are ultimately going to save you time. Like the example was kind of, rather than send free emails or chase emails or have an employee wait 2 days, you can click a button and they get that and it's done immediately, and therefore you're saving yourself time. Likewise, again, with a GL file, if you're in control of that file and something is wrong, then that's gone wrong internally and you need to look at what you've done, rather than you get it from a provider and it's all over the place. You're then asking maybe 10 different questions, and then again, you're waiting for answers, and then you get the answer and you're having to try and work out what those answers mean. For me, that's more work than actually having the tools at your fingertips. But yeah, I mean, if you do have a provider that's then saying, well, no, now we want you to fill in 20 more columns every month than you were doing every month before, because that makes our life easier as the provider, then that's where you'd be like, well, hold on, that's not a technology improvement. That's not saving us time. That's you asking us to do your work. So that's kind of where you'd need to make sure you're differentiating the two. But yeah, I definitely think on a very high, vague level that you do want to be taking control of your own destiny, I suppose would be a bit dramatic, but yeah, that would certainly be my take on it.
And I think Jen showed a nice example there as well, right? Where you have a new pay element in sort of a traditional model, a managed service model, you would have to go to the vendor and say, look, there's a new pay element. Can you help me map this? I want to have it mapped like this. And maybe they don't get it right the first time, and you have 3 and 4 back and forth. And within, the solution that Jen showed you within Payzaar, basically the system first of all alerts you that there's a new pay element, so you don't just sort of trip over it. The system actually draws your attention to it, and then it lets you take an action on that in a very easy self-service manner right there and then. And you're done with it without having to chase someone down and wait for them to take an action.
Yeah.
Very good. Well, listen, I think that's all we have time for today. Rob, thank you so much for being on with us today. Jen, great job for walking us through some of the examples that show how self-service can work. And everyone out there, thank you for joining us today. Again, session is recorded. You'll get a link to the recording. And please join us again if you like what you heard today. So have a great rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.